Thanks for joining. My name is Dr. Rebecca Mears. I'm a member of the VIN Foundation Student Debt Education Team. I'm just going to take care of a couple of housekeeping things, answer some typical questions that we get before I kick it over to Tony to really dive into today's material. So thank you all for joining. Thank you. Huge shout out to ACVIM for helping to partner and share about this information. I know there's a ton of questions out in the world about student debt and repayment right now. So I know Tony's going to do a great job hoping to answer some of those. We've got the chat here for you as well as the Q&A. You can ask questions in the Q&A anonymously, so try to keep those questions there. If you have any technical issues, feel free to use the chat for there. You can also upvote those questions in the Q&A. So if you see a similar question to your own, that lets us know to, kind of prioritize those questions as well. There will also be a follow-up email with the link to the recording and some other information, as well as for those that are joining us live, the link to fill out your CE certificate. And so that'll be in the follow-up email that will come from studentdebt@vinfoundation.org. So keep an eye out for that. Usually takes us a day or two to get that out. So just keep an eye out for that a little bit later on this week. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Tony and let us get started here.
Great, thanks, Becca. And I would really like to emphasize that please take this opportunity to ask some questions because right now with student loans, it's really, really hard to make sense of what's going on. So we're going to just lay that out there. We're going to do our best to tell you where things are right now, where they may likely end up, but things keep changing as frequently as last week, as frequently as this week. And then, oh, by the way, we've got that pesky election that's coming up next week that will also have an impact on where this all goes next. So, from our experience on the message boards and the VIN message boards and replying to our colleagues there are things that just don't make a lot of sense, right? So if you're seeing something that doesn't make sense, please ask, and we'll do our best to kind of chime in on what our experience is with those particular things. You do have the ability to ask questions anonymously too, so hopefully that makes it more likely for you to ask those questions. But there's a lot of unknowns, right? And we're going to deal with that head on today. We're going to show you what you can do to remove as many of the unknowns as possible and put yourself in the best position as you can to reach your student loan repayment goals. And for many of you, at least for those of you that submitted those primary concerns as part of your registration, most of those were around public service loan forgiveness, which is what we're going to focus on a lot this evening. So there are a lot of things that you can do to make sure that you're in a position to make sure that you reach public service loan forgiveness sooner rather than later. And we want to make sure that everybody's at least checking those boxes while we await what comes next, hopefully a little more definitively on the student loan repayment front. And I do like to try to, turn these into more clinical type cases, right? That's how our brains are wired. So we're going to talk about doing your annual student loan physical exam, and with all the uncertainty that's going on, that should probably be, more frequently, right? Probably monthly. So, if not more frequently than that. So there's just so much that I thought it'd be impossible for the student loans to change more than it did during the pandemic, and this is even more frequent and more confusing. So it just keeps going, right? And we're not out of the woods yet in terms of the confusing stuff, but thankfully we do have some more information to work with. So if you've attended any of these before, or you're familiar with what we call the one-time forgiveness count adjustment that was going on for a long time, we do have a way for you to check the status of that, in addition to looking at your public service loan forgiveness progress. So we'll want to make sure that everybody here is aware of how to find that information and look for things that either make sense to you or don't make sense to you, which might give you a little more homework to do. From there, we'll come up with our best treatment plan that we can do, knowing that it's probably going to change, right? We're going to have to adjust as we learn more information. There's going to be some side effects that we know, and there's going to be some side effects that we don't know. So we'll talk about what those could be, and hopefully some of those questions that you have around those. And then ultimately the prognosis, right? So as uncertain as student loans do seem, this will end, this will pass. We will get to something that resembles whatever normal is for student loans, again, it's just a matter of when and what that ultimately looks like. So some of the questions that you all submitted, not surprising, right? What did we do while SAVE is in limbo? So SAVE being the Saving on a Valuable Education Plan, the latest in the income-driven repayment options that was converted from revised pay-as-you-earn, but then was blocked by the courts, and that's currently why that is in limbo. What to do with large amounts of student debt, and this is also a common complaint, if you will, around student loans. Large is a pretty subjective term. It really, depends on how you internalize debt. For some people, large is 50,000. For other people, large isn't, really that big of a deal until it's more than 500,000, right? So, and we see everything along that spectrum as well. So it really depends. We want to kind of take some of these subjective terms out of there and actually work with some of the numbers and talk about what those mean, because certainly it's always easier to manage less than it is to manage more. But if you do have more student debt, that means you have to be a little more careful, because mistakes or changes can impact you on a bigger scale, right? Because that principal balance is larger and interest accrual can be larger. So we have to be aware of trying to avoid as many of those mistakes as we can. Another good one that came in was planning to do public service loan forgiveness, currently IBR expiring and applied for SAVE. For years, we've seen confusion around the names of the repayment options. And that was one of the things that this administration was trying to fix, was to make things, quote, simpler, which is kind of laughable at this point, given where it ended up. But the names are extremely important, and they've never been more important, because what plan you're currently using and which plans are available are extremely relevant, particularly for those of you that are trying to get to public service loan forgiveness, right? So we really have to know which repayment plan we're using. This kind of the willy-nilly calling everything IBR is just not going to cut it anymore, right? Because that can get you into some big trouble if we don't know which repayment options we're using, which is ultimately going to tell us whether or not we should think about switching or staying put. Refinancing, no way, right? Please don't. When I talk about refinancing, I am specifically referring to taking your federal student loans and paying them off with a private loan. That's a really bad idea, right? And it's really, really risky, because a private loan is never going to have the benefits that your federal student loans have. Your federal student loans are the most flexible, but as we're seeing recently, most annoying debt you'll ever have, right? But we can deal with the annoying parts. If you refinance them, you're really kind of fixed into things that may not work out so well for you, especially if your circumstances change. How much to pay if you're hoping to get public service loan forgiveness? That's what we're going to focus on, and the quote best way to pay back, right? I really don't have an answer for that right now, right? We're going to have to just kind of look at what's available and do a pros and cons list and see what makes the most sense, and be willing to adjust as needed. But ultimately here, we're just trying to reduce your student loan stress and improve your opportunity to achieve loan repayment success. So we will do our best in that regard, based on the information that we currently have available. All right, so why do I do this? I'm a veterinarian. I'm married to a veterinarian, actually an ACVIM member. She's a specialist in small animal internal medicine and practices here along the Front Range in Denver, where we live. But we both have a boatload of student debt, right? So more than $400,000 combined. And we've also run the gamut on the available repayment options and experienced all of the changes that have happened, since we entered repayment around 2012. So we've got a lot of experience with the student loan repayment system. And then I've spent more than 10 years now working with VIN and VIN Foundation, helping our veterinary colleagues work through their student loan repayment options, questions, strategies. So we've got a whole database of cases to pull from in terms of trying to help you make sense of your repayment strategy here. So we, looked at using a time-driven plan, a standard 10-year plan, way back when, but because of the amount of student debt we had, the monthly payment was just was just too much, right? We wouldn't have been able to make that, let alone have any kind of financial wellness plan on top of that. And that's where those income-driven plans are so valuable, particularly for veterinarians. You're allowed to make payments based on your income. And for some of you, those payments can also be eligible for public service loan forgiveness. For others, if you're not working towards public service loan forgiveness, there's still a forgiveness path at the end. It just takes a little bit longer. And that's currently the path my wife and I are on. Right? So we're going to make payments for a specified period of time. The current plans that we're eligible for have a maximum repayment period of 25 years. So if we still have a balance at the end of that 25-year period, which is quite likely for us, we will see our loan balance forgiven, and we may or may not have to pay tax on what's remaining. The big difference for those of you that are working towards public service loan forgiveness, if you have a balance remaining and you reach public service loan forgiveness, there is no tax, right? So you won't have to pay a tax on what's remaining. All right, so we started out with the original version of IBR. There's now 2 versions of IBR. You're eligible for one or the other. But then a new repayment option came online. There was actually another one called Pay As You Earn, but we weren't eligible for that. And we'll talk about that as well. Your eligibility for these plans really plays a role in what your quote best repayment strategy is going to be. But then a newer version came online called Revised Pay As You Earn that we were eligible for. That's the one that then became SAVE, and then SAVE is now tied up in the courts. But even before we got there, we had that pesky pandemic. But during the pandemic, student loans, this is kind of when a lot of things started to go differently. Let's call it that. For those of us that had student loans at the time, particularly for veterinarians, it was extremely beneficial for anyone who was using these income-driven plans. We didn't have payments due. There was no interest that accrued. We were still getting forgiveness credit for that time. And that pandemic forbearance period lasted for nearly 4 years, just recently ended. And then coming out of that is where we had some of the additional attempts at changing these plans. So switching repay to save and retiring pay as you earn, and another previous plan called income contingent repayment. But then there were some lawsuits about, hey, I think we've gone a little too far here. A judge found that to be reasonable and said, hey, you can't do this save plan until we hear these both sides of these cases and make a ruling on whether or not this is created lawfully. So that's where we are right now. So everybody that was using SAVE is in a quote general forbearance where no interest is accruing, no payments are due, but you're also not earning any forgiveness credit or income-driven plans or for public service loan forgiveness, since that plan hasn't been blocked starting on July, I think it was July 22nd of 2024. So who knows where that's going to end up. The arguments for that case started last Thursday. So hopefully we'll have some kind of ruling in the not so distant future. But whatever happens there is likely to be another appeal. So it's going to probably be some time before we actually find out what happens next in regards to SAVE. And that's why last week the administration came out and said, hey, this general forbearance that you're in is going to last for at least another 6 months, right? So if not longer, right? But right, the language they used last week was that at least another 6 months. So as I mentioned, for those of us that are not working towards public service loan forgiveness, there could be a tax at the end of this pathway, right? So my wife and I are planning as if we're going to have to pay that tax, and we're about 90% of the way towards our projected forgiveness tax goal, with a little more than halfway to go to reach there. So about 13 years, which essentially just means we're ahead of schedule. So we have a dedicated account that we contribute funds to in order to reach that projected tax target. And this is a snapshot of that account. This is through a service called Wealthfront. It's a robo-advisor. There's dozens of these out there. That just happens to be the one that I like. But this dotted line is the amount that we contributed. The solid line is the value of that investment, right? And the difference here is essentially money that is not coming out of our pocket to pay for that tax, should we have to pay it once we reach forgiveness. So the longer that we have for this to grow, the bigger that gap will get, the less we'll actually pay out of pocket for that potential tax if we have to pay for it. So one of the things that always trips up our colleagues is, how much to pay towards their student loans. And a lot of veterinarians, even if their minimum payment is zero or low, or especially during this crazy period with the pandemic where we've had payments shut off, or now again they're shut off, the inclination is always to make payments, right, in some manner, and sometimes making payments above the minimum. And we don't do that, right? And that's because if we do, we'll voluntarily pay more than we have to towards our student loans, right? Particularly if we're on a path to reach forgiveness. And for those of you that are heading towards public service loan forgiveness, hopefully that would make some sense, right? I mean, if you had a minimum payment of $100 a month and you were hoping to have your remaining student loan balance forgiven and pay no tax on it, it really wouldn't make any financial sense for you to pay $200 a month instead of the $100 a month that's due, right? You just be voluntarily paying $100 more than you have to, right? So there's really not, and this is what drives a lot of people crazy with federal student loans. One of the things that makes them the most flexible debt, but annoying debt you'll ever have, is that there's really no incentive for you to pay more than your income requires or to pay them back more quickly. And this is what makes everybody's head explode. People that have debt, or the people that don't have debt that are on the outside looking in, are like, well, why don't you just pay it off? Right. And it's like, well, because there's really not a good financial incentive to do so. Right. And in most cases, if you do try to, and you still end up reaching forgiveness, you're going to end up voluntarily paying more than you have to. And that's not a very good use of your limited funds. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit more about, how you can, do this student loan physical exam. We're definitely going to dive into, where are we right now, right? Because it's extremely confusing, and then try to tackle some of these questions that you guys had with your registration forms, right? So if you're in Save Now and you've only got 2 payments left to go before you reach 120 payments, ooh, man, that's tough, right? I mean, you're knocking on the door, and all of a sudden the courts say, hey, we can't do this anymore. Like, how do you get to that finish line? And if you got a little bit more than 2 payments to go, what should you be thinking about, right? And those are probably some different answers, although there might be some overlap there as well. But it also depends upon which repayment options you have available to you. And this is where this student loan physical exam comes in to play. So what we're looking for, because again, it wouldn't be, federal student loans if they weren't complicated, right? We've got a whole host of different types of student loans that you might have. And unfortunately, only certain types are eligible for things like income-driven repayment or public service loan forgiveness. So we really want to focus on, how much of our loans have direct in the name, and do we have other types of loans that do not have direct in the name? Right. So if you've been in higher education for quite a long time, you might have some of these federal family education loans. So those were discontinued in 2010. The other more common loan types that we see floating around for veterinarians are Perkins loans, which were discontinued in 2018. Health profession student loans I still see quite commonly, particularly if you graduated from a state college of veterinary medicine. And then there's also loans for disadvantaged students, which I see more infrequently, but are very similar to health profession student loans. These are all types of federal student loans, right? And they're all eligible for things like income-driven repayment and public service loan forgiveness, as long as you take the step to consolidate them into a direct consolidation loan. They would then have direct in the name, makes them eligible for these income-driven plans and public service loan forgiveness. Private loans are anything that doesn't fall into that category. They usually have a bank name associated with them. So Sallie Mae, Discover, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, those types of things. They're not eligible for any of the federal student loan repayment options or benefits like public service loan forgiveness. So you have to manage those separately from your federal student loans if you have both types of balances. And this is another reason why we don't recommend that you refinance federal student loans with private student loans, because again, it takes away all of those benefits that come with those federal student loans. If you've lost track of anything, you can check a credit report, annualcreditreport.com. I think you can still do that for free, pretty much as you want right now. They used to be once per year, and I would do it right around the time we would file our tax return. But since the pandemic, they've opened that up so you can check that credit report more frequently without paying for it. So I would encourage you to do that, especially if you lost track of something or if you think there's something funny going on with your lines of credit, or this is where you find if somebody opened a credit card in your name, or if you've lost track of any bills or anything like that, that you're getting some calls from a collector or something like that. You'll find out what that is and where it's from on your credit report. All right, so how do we find the information on our student loans? We're going to check studentaid.gov, right? So this is where you went to apply for federal student loans, but this is also where you go to apply for repayment or to find details on your student loan. So let's take a venture over there. And this is the Federal Student Aid website. Lots of information on here. They've been changing this a lot as well. Also have some updates on what's going on with the SAVE plan and Pay As You Earn and ICR. But I'm going to log in because I'm looking for my student loan details. And it's going to do this two-factor thing, which is usually very, very fast. Scary language. And it's going to take you to a summary after it asks you to confirm your contact information, which is very important, but I do these a lot. So it asks me to confirm my contact information like twice a day. So, but if you have moved recently or you've changed emails or phone numbers or anything like that, you definitely want to make sure that that information is up to date so you can get all of the latest and greatest information. Telling me about the new dashboard. This gives you a high level overview of what's remaining, principal, any interest that you might have, but this isn't really enough information. That's not what I'm looking for. I'm looking for the more detailed information here. So I'm going to hit the view details button. It's going to take me to the next screen, my aid dashboard, and this is the button I'm looking for, right? So the download my aid data, right? So if I click that, it'll download this TXT file to my device. I want to save that to my device, and then I'll show you what we're going to do with that, right? Because that's going to contain all of the details that pertain to this student loan physical exam, right? I gave up a long time ago on going to the loan servicer website to get reliable or consistent information because they all present it a little bit differently. And then of course we have the problem that some loan servicers swap in and out of the game here, and then your loans get moved, and then the system looks even different than it did from the previous loan servicer. Everything in that student aid data file is consistent, right? So it doesn't, the data changes, right? They add new fields and things to that all the time, but it's still consistent for everyone, no matter who your loan servicer is. And everything that we have built on the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center is designed to work alongside that file structure. So that's where we're going to head next, right? So we're going to check out the first of the free tools that we're going to cover tonight, which is this afternoon, which is the VIN Foundation My Student Loans tool. Lives in the VIN Foundation Student Debt Center. Right, so publicly available resource. Anybody can use this. Everybody does use this, but it's designed specifically for veterinarians and veterinary students. You'll also notice here, and especially if you visit this right now or after this session, it'll ask you to log in if you have a VIN username and password. And good news, all academicians have free access to VIN. All interns, residents at academic institutions have free access to VIN. If you don't have a VIN username and password, then activate that, right? That's extremely useful. But we also have a special area on VIN called the Student Debt Message Boards, where we actually provide personalized assistance for your student debt questions, right? And this will help you get there, right? So you can see here, it knows that I'm logged in, but it'll also save your file if you upload it, so you don't have to do that over and over and over again. So I've got an example one from from one of you that I anonymized prior to this presentation. Right, so show you here. This is a veterinarian who graduated in 2019 and recently finished their residency and is now doing has a postdoc position, and recently posted on VIN about getting public service loan forgiveness credit for their past internship and residency experiences. Right. So this is one of those things that we want to help you understand and help you take advantage of. Right. So I'll get to that in just a second. But before we do that, I just want to go through some of the information that we're seeing here. Right. So in this file, right, we can see we've got $239,000 of principal, $36,000 of unpaid interest. Here's our total balance. Here's the weighted average interest rate across all of the remaining loans, which is 17, right? So there's 17 different loan types in here. We can see that they all have little various interest rates depending on the loan type and when they started borrowing. But we can also see which repayment plan they're using, right? In this case, we know that they're using pay-as-you-earn, right? Which is a type of income-driven plan. It's eligible for public service loan forgiveness credit. That's great, right? We can see that 100% of the balance is with Nelnet. And if I go to the loan groups, I see that 100% of that balance is also in that direct loan category, right? Which is great, right? Because direct loans are eligible for the income-driven repayment plans as well as public service loan forgiveness, right? So I'm checking those boxes. I know that I've got the right loan types here to be eligible for all of those things. And then I want to check this income-driven repayment eligibility tab. Right now, not everybody is eligible for all of the different income-driven plans. When you started borrowing, the types of student loans that you have determine which IDR profile, I call it. So the IDR profiles, this particular profile is profile 2, which means that you're eligible for the original version of IBR, pay-as-you-earn, save before it was blocked, but not the new version of IBR. Right, so the new version of IBR is only accessible by people who took their first student loan after July 1st of 2014. So generally speaking, in order to be even considered for that, you would have to be a 2018 graduate from veterinary school or later. Now this person's a 2019 grad, but they also have some loans from undergrad, right? So if you can see these subsidized loans that are before July 1st of 2014, so that takes them out of the running for being eligible for IBR 2014, which is too bad because IBR 2014 is very similar to pay-as-you-earn. It has a lower monthly payment, a lower time to forgiveness than this older version of IBR. Right, but since this person's already in pay-as-you-earn, that's good, right? Because we know that even though the courts blocked save, right, and there's no forgiveness credit currently being issued for save, if you're in pay-as-you-earn, you still get forgiveness credit, and it can still count towards public service loan forgiveness. But they also phased out save on July 1st of 2014. As long as you were in it by that date, you can keep using it. Now they may reopen it, which they posted this week, that they're thinking about reopening pay-as-you-earn, but that likely depends upon who wins the election next week. So a lot of unknowns there. However, this person is in a good position to receive public service loan forgiveness credit, provided that their employment details meet the requirements for public service loan forgiveness. In regards to whether or not they actually have any credit logged yet, we can check the public service loan forgiveness status tab, right? So your public service loan forgiveness credit is logged in that text file, in that student aid data file. We can see here that this person hasn't logged any time yet, right? But I do know that they did a nonprofit internship. They did a academic residency, and now they're a postdoc at an academic institution. All of those things have the potential to be public service loan forgiveness qualifying, which means they can submit a public service loan forgiveness employment certification form and potentially go back and get 4 years of credit, 48 months of credit towards public service loan forgiveness. Right, so they just have to submit to have that documented, right? And then you can get that clock ticking, right? And I've got another example we'll work through in just a little bit here that will show somebody who actually has that time already logged, right? So if you don't see any public service loan forgiveness time logged in your student loan physical exam, then it's time to submit that employment certification form if you're in academia or if you're working for a nonprofit that you think would be eligible for public service loan forgiveness. And you can go back in time, right? So you can go back and apply for that prior time. You have to have your employer from those various organizations sign off that you were an employee during those particular timeframes, right? So it's usually better to do that while you're there than waiting until later. But you can go back and get retroactive credit for that if you haven't logged it just yet. All right, so what's the latest and greatest? So saving on a valuable education, one of those income-driven repayment options, is blocked since July. Anybody that is using Save, including myself, including my wife, have been put into this general forbearance, it's called. So no interest, no payments for at least the next 6 months, but we're also not earning forgiveness credit, right? Whether that's public service loan forgiveness or income-driven repayment. We also don't have to worry about recertifying our income because again, we're not technically in Save. I mean, we were, but then they moved us into this special general forbearance, but we don't have to provide income recertification information until we hear what's next for those of us that are in Save. Forgiveness for any of the what I call the ICR plans is paused. So one of the things that has been highlighted by this court case is how forgiveness was first created under the original income-driven plan called income contingent repayment. And there's some question as to whether or not Congress had specified forgiveness or if the Department of Education kind of made that up and the details surrounding that. So all of the plans, so ICR was created in 1994, right? And all of the plans, pay-as-you-earn, revised pay-as-you-earn, Save, were based off of that original ICR plan. So that's what has called into question the forgiveness pathway for any of the plans that were created under the ICR umbrella. Fortunately, we do have a separate law that was passed that was, again, kind of based on ICR originally, but specified a new repayment option called income-based repayment that specifically spells out forgiveness by Congress when it was created. Right, so forgiveness under the IBR plans is not in question. Right, so we do have kind of that fallback option should we need it, right? But this is what the courts are kind of wrestling with right now: is what did they mean when they created that, and did they do that with the appropriate authority? And that's what's going to kind of fall out of these recent court cases coming soon. As part of that blockage, they paused all of the income-driven repayment applications, recalculations, and recertifications. They did say this week that we'll be resuming those soon, whatever the hell that means. So they're essentially, what that tells me is they're moving from a state of being paused to, hey, let's start calculating the ones that we know we can calculate. Right, which would be people who have applied for IBR or anybody that's switching from Save to a plan like IBR, or if you had a income renewal date that had passed, submitting that annual recertification. Those are the things they're going to start processing again. They are, and they just posted this week too. Pay-as-you-earn and ICR are set to reopen, quote, this fall. Right, that's probably going to depend upon what happens next week, right? So vote. There are obviously differences between what would happen depending on who gets elected. If you follow any of those types of things, there's one side that wants to eliminate income-driven repayment and public service loan forgiveness altogether, and there's another side that's trying to expand access to student loan forgiveness and make student loans more, repayment more favorable, right? So it's a pretty big issue. It affects, anybody that cares about student loans and has student loans for sure. And it unfortunately has become kind of a political football as of late. One of those wedge issues that, they've discovered that some people really hate this idea and other people are really enjoying it or benefiting from it. Welcome to being involved in that kind of a process and having some of this subject to the whims of voting. If you apply during this time frame that everything is blocked, you are allowed a 60-day processing forbearance. If it takes them longer than 60 days, then you can request a general forbearance. The processing forbearance is forgiveness eligible. The general forbearance is not, right? So if you decide that, hey, I don't want to stay and save, I'm going to apply for IVR, or I'm going to wait until they reopen pay as you earn, and I'm going to apply for one of those plans, it can take them more than 60 days to process that application, and it probably will, given the fact that they've been shut off for so long, and it's going to take a long time to work through that backlog. That first 60 days will be forgiveness eligible, right? So for that person who is looking for 2 more qualifying payments, it may make sense for them to switch out of save into something like IVR or wait for pay as you earn if they're eligible for pay as you earn. And that 2-month period that they're waiting for that application to process would be forgiveness eligible. Public service loan forgiveness eligible could help them reach that 120 payment threshold, right? But after that, if it's still taking them longer to process that application, then you can request a general forbearance. No interest will accrue, no payments are due, but no forgiveness credit is granted during that time frame either. Right. The other difference between the processing forbearance and the general forbearance is that interest accrues during the processing forbearance. So those have been 2 terms that have become relevant recently. It can be difficult to get clarification from your loan servicers on which status you're in. One of the tip-offs is if you're accruing interest, you're probably in a processing forbearance. And if you're not, you're likely in a general forbearance. All right, so let's see what's next. All right, so the one-time forgiveness count adjustment. This was a benefit that came out of this current administration. Because of all the issues people have had with student loans, they had offered an opportunity to help expand the amount of time that you might have qualifying towards forgiveness. And there was a specific window where that went all the way through mid-summer of this year, where if you consolidated your loans, any loans that had different amounts of repayment time or entered repayment at different times, or you had used various repayment options for, would all be credited with forgiveness credit. And we've been waiting for them to apply this. It isn't in a easy place to find, but there is a way for you to see it, right? So this also requires you to be logged in to studentaid.gov, right? So I'm already logged in, or I should be. Let me see. Oh, my session has expired. Let me log back in. Kicked me out pretty fast. So I'm going to log back in there. And then I've got a link in there that will take you to your forgiveness payment count adjustment. Can't talk at the same time. Get that right? 096849. All right, scary language again. All right, once I'm logged in, all right, there's a link to, you have to open a new browser tab, and you're going to go directly to this link, which is probably what they're going to use with the loan servicers or with the federal student aid website to display that number, but it's not all hooked up yet, right? So if I click on this link now that I'm logged in, it'll actually give me all of the ugly payment count adjustment data. Right, so this will also show you if you've got public service loan forgiveness qualifying payments, but we already had a way to do that using the employment certification form, and that data was already in our file. What we were missing was any qualifying time towards forgiveness outside of public service loan forgiveness. And this is where I can see that for my loans, right? I can see that I've got nearly 12 years of qualifying time. So 143 months, 1 month shy of 12 years, which leaves me about 13 years remaining, right? 13 years and 1 month, right? So which is expected for me, right? That passes a smell test for me. But I would encourage everybody to check their forgiveness payment count adjustment, particularly if you've had a bit of a tortured path through the higher education system, to see exactly how much qualifying forgiveness time that you have. Right, the closer you're to 20 or 25 years, depending on your income-driven repayment eligibility, or the closest you are to 10 years using public service loan forgiveness, the closer you are to having your loans forgiven. Right, and that's always been one of the big questions that's been difficult to answer is how do I know where I am? Right, and now we do have a way to see where we are in that particular time frame. One of the other things that just got updated this week, actually, I'm not even sure that it was announced yet, but what will be coming out very soon is that anybody who has an anniversary date before February of 2025 will essentially have 1 year added to that. Right. So again, because of all of the pausing and interruptions by the courts and the uncertainty around the repayment plans, calculating annual payments has been difficult, right? So as part of, the loan servicer is pretty much just stopping the accepting of applications, that's complicated these anniversary dates. So when you use an income-driven plan, the way that your payment is calculated is based on your income, and you generally have to provide updated income information at least annually in order to have your payment continued to be calculated based on your income. That has really been interrupted since the pandemic forbearance, and they've tried to restart it, right? And we were kind of getting in the flow of updating income information, and then all of a sudden, the courts block save, and that really, put a monkey wrench into everything again. And now we're back to extending those anniversary dates into the future so we can give people some time to catch up, and we also have some time to see what's going to happen next. So it could be that you're going to have student loan minimum payments that are based on income from 4, 5, 6 years ago at this point, right? And that's fine, right? I mean, presumably your incomes have increased. If they haven't, then you can have the payment recalculated lower to reflect a decrease in your income. But it's not a bad thing to have your income-driven payment still be reflective of income from 2020, particularly if your income has increased since then, right? You're still earning forgiveness credit, except if you're in that save forbearance, and your payment is still very low based on that older income information. But that, you do want to know what your anniversary date is, right? So, and that's another thing that we can check in our student loan physical exam. So coming back to our example, right? So in the My Student Loans tool, this case that I uploaded here, if I go to any of these first 3 tabs and I expand the details and I look at the repayment plan, if I'm using an income-driven repayment plan, then I'll have an anniversary date, right? And we can see here that this person's minimum monthly payment is $43, right? They don't have to renew that until September of next year, right? So that's a great place to be in. Right, this is probably reflecting their last year of residency income, right? And they're in a postdoc, which they're earning a higher stipend or salary now, right? They still have the benefit of that lower payment for longer, right? That's a good place to be. So check your anniversary date, right? And if you see something in there that's before February of 2025, then look for 1 year to be added to it. All right. Any questions so far on where we are in that process? Feel free to put those in the chat, or even if you want to, maybe you can. I'm not sure if we allow you to unmute yourself, but if you raise your hand, we can let you do that too. So feel free to post some questions or anything in there, and we'll jump on them. All right, great. So I can see a question from Carrie. I'm currently in SAVE working towards public service loan forgiveness and was expected to qualify December 2026, but it's now been bumped to February 2027, likely longer with the current status of things. With the forbearance being in place for what could be several more months, should I switch to IBR or just sit tight? So this is a great example, right? So this is a great example of I would do that student loan physical exam and check my income driven repayment eligibility, right? And what does it show? Right now, if you're in what I call IBR profile 3, I actually have that example. Let me upload that one. Right. For those folks are only eligible for the old version of IBR or SAVE. Right. So we're going to want to know which profile you're in, right? Because if we can find a way for you to get forgiveness credit that doesn't involve using the old version of IBR, then that's what we want to do. Right, so let me upload this other example that I have. All right, so this person has time documented in their public service loan forgiveness time documented in their file. And we see that up here, but we'll also see that in this PSLF status tab, right? But we want to look at the income driven repayment eligibility, right? Currently they're in SAVE, which means they're in that general forbearance and they're not earning any forgiveness credit. Right. So the only other income driven option they have available to them is the old version of IBR. Right. And in that case, right, I would be more apt to wait, right? Especially if you can, at least if you can afford to, right? This all that then comes down to what do you see yourself doing in the short, medium term, and how much forgiveness time do you have, right? So this person has a little more than 6 years, right? They've got at least 3+ years to go, right? Are they, I have worked with some veterinarians who are like, as soon as I hit that public service loan forgiveness, I'm out of here, right? I mean, if that's you and you need to get to that public service loan forgiveness credit finish line fastest, then maybe you want to consider switching to IBR. However, I would probably, if you don't see yourself leaving a public service loan forgiveness qualifying position anytime soon, right? So you're going to be there for longer than 3-4 years for your best guess, then it's not a bad place to be to not have to make payments, not see your interest accrue, and wait to see what happens with SAVE, right? Because there's a possibility, let's say that they flush SAVE, right? Maybe REPAYE comes back, at least as a public service loan forgiveness qualifying option. REPAYE would be a better option in many cases than the old version of IBR, right? So I kind of want to see what is going to happen next. Right now, there's some other things that could happen. Let's say that Trump wins next week. Chances are they're not going to defend the SAVE plan, which means whatever the court has ruled about SAVE not being appropriate means that there will be no SAVE. What happens after that, I have no idea, right? But there's enough uncertainty there, which would tell me maybe you do want to switch to IBR, right? Because I don't know what's going to happen after that, right? We'll have to wait and see even longer. So it really kind of depends. It's a little bit too soon to say that you should, in this case, switch to the old version of IBR. Now, if you're eligible for pay as you earn, right, I would wait until they announce that you can apply for pay as you earn again and use that plan, right? Because again, the payment's going to be lower. And ultimately, if you want to reach public service loan forgiveness, you want to pay the least that you have to towards your student loans. Pay as you earn would be a better option than the old version of IBR, right? So it really depends on what your income driven repayment plan eligibility is, right? And how willing and able you are to wait a little bit to see what happens next. Yeah. So in that, if you can't afford to, if you can afford to, I would sit tight at least for next week to see, you know, at least what administration are we going to be dealing with, right? I mean, obviously one is going to be a little more friendly to, you know, fixing the student loan issues we're having now versus one that is looking to kind of just end this experiment altogether, right? Which is going to be extremely difficult, but it's certainly not going to help things. All right, so just in general, kind of taking a step back and looking at what are our repayment options overall, right? So there are generally fall into two categories: time driven and income driven, right? So time driven are kind of more traditional, what everybody's usually familiar with in terms of a car loan, a home mortgage, or any other loan that you're going to have, right? You're going to take out that amount of money. It's going to have an interest rate. You're going to agree upon a set amount of time to pay that back, and that's what's going to determine the minimum monthly payment, right? So you can do that with your federal student loans too, right? Those options are not eligible for public service loan forgiveness, right? The 10-year one is, but that's not very helpful, right? But you can do that with your federal student loans. The problem becomes, depending on how much you borrowed for veterinary school and how much you have after your training, that payment can be pretty hefty, right? And then that's where those income-driven options come into play, right? And this is where, we're kind of in that wait and see mode, right? This is what things look like, right? Before, caution, we're going to have it's going to get a little ugly here, right? We had revised pay as you earn turned into save. Save got blocked in July. As part of creating save, we eliminated or phased out pay as you earn and income contingent. But now we're going to potentially bring those back this fall, right? And that's all going to depend upon, what happens next week, what the courts rule on save, right? So there is quite a bit of uncertainty there. And as we already talked about, there are two versions of IBR. You're either eligible for one or the other. IBR 2014 is more beneficial than the old version of IBR. So if we can avoid it, we don't want to have to switch into the old version of IBR unless absolutely necessary, right? And it's just too soon to say that for sure. Brianna asked, what are the best recommendations for someone in public service loan forgiveness, 3 years left in marriage in terms of income? Yeah, that same kind of answer there, Brianna. So what income-driven plans are you eligible for, right? Which one are you currently using, right? And how are you filing your taxes, right? So do you file your taxes jointly or separately? And then also, what state do you live in, right? Do you live in a community property state? There are 13 community property states. So that was a little bit more difficult to answer generally, right? That's a great one for the student debt message board area, right? So it gives me an excuse to kind of come over there, show you what that looks like. You can post anonymously in there in the student debt message board area. For a couple of you who have submitted some student debt and income signalment forms already, you're familiar with what this looks like, right? So we have you answer some a set of questions. We post a summary of those answers over to the message board area anonymously. We'll know who you are. Beck and I will know who you are, but the rest of the community does not, right? But we use this information, this minimum database, to then answer those types of questions, right? And what your income is, how you're paid, how you file your taxes, what state you live in, all of those things are going to play a role in trying to answer that question, right? So we go through and we first do that student loan physical exam with you, review those repayment options that you currently have, which one are you currently using. Some of the plans allow you to separate your income from your spouse if you file your taxes separately, right? But filing your taxes separately also generally means you're probably going to pay more in taxes, right? So there has to be an obvious financial benefit in terms of paying much less towards your student loan, right? So that's probably one of the more complicated questions that we work through over on the student debt message board area. So there's a whole host of factors that go into that, and we can help you. Sometimes it's a no-brainer, right? If you're the only one with the student debt, if your income is higher than your spouse's income and your spouse doesn't have any student loans themselves, sometimes it's going to make sense, or most times it's going to make sense to file your taxes separately, right? So you keep that minimum monthly payment lower. right? But if you both have student debt, like my wife and I both have student debt, there generally isn't as much incentive for you to file separately. Right now, sometimes that changes depending on the differences in your incomes, your respective incomes, and what your respective student loan balances are. But we have ways of helping you work through those questions over here on the message board. And then it also gives you a place to kind of return to and ask follow-ups and visit with an accountant. And hey, my accountant said it's going to cost us 10 grand extra in taxes to file separately. Do you still think it's a good idea? Well, let's look and see how much you stand to save in your monthly student loan payments. Does it eclipse $10,000? If so, then file separately. If not, maybe it doesn't make sense for you to do that this year, but you'll want to revisit it the following year. So that's kind of how we work through those types of questions. All right, income-driven repayment, generally how they calculate your monthly payments, right? This is all part of answering those types of questions. What's your taxable income? That's why we need to know what your income is. Ideally, we want to look at what your tax return shows, right? So your adjusted gross income, right? Because that's what they're going to plug into this equation, right? Unless you tell them not to, right? So some people's previous tax return shows a higher adjusted gross income than maybe they're earning now, right? In that case, you don't have to use your tax return. You can send them something newer, like a pay stub that shows a lower annualized income, right? So they're pretty flexible in terms of the income information that you're allowed to provide. But oftentimes it's easiest, makes the most sense to use the adjusted gross income from your recently filed tax return. They will either subtract off 150% of the federal poverty guidelines, or under SAVE, they were subtracting off 225% of the federal poverty guidelines. That's what made SAVE such a beneficial repayment plan. The payments were much lower than they were under some of the prior income-driven repayment options. But even if we have to return to some of the older ones, 150% of the federal poverty guidelines for pay-as-you-earn, the new version of IBR, and the old version of IBR, but the percentage that they take of that resulting discretionary income is different depending on the option that you're eligible for. So that's, again, why that income-driven repayment eligibility tab is so important, right? Which of these options do you have available to you? This is just some example of, at $125,000 of taxable income, what can you expect your minimum monthly payment to be, right? So doing that sanity check too, to make sure that your loan servicer or the Department of Education is actually calculating that payment correctly is also a good step to go through as part of your student loan physical exam. Here's just some ideas of, various incomes for this table is calculated only for single people. But if, so a family size of one, what your minimum monthly payment would be at a variety of different income levels. So if you, know what your income is and you do your student loan physical exam and you're looking at your monthly payment that it's showing, how does that compare to what you expect it to be based on the math for your current situation, right? And that'll also kind of give you an idea of if you're getting a pretty good deal or not. Right. So that was one of the examples we just worked through recently, or one of the specialists who posted on the boards, right? Should I switch to IBR? Currently, they've got a $0 payment, nothing due. They're in the SAVE forbearance. If they switch to IBR, their payment's going to be close to $1,000 a month, right? Is it worth it to you to do that? Or maybe you want to wait a little bit to see if there's maybe a better option that comes out of the fallout from this court case stuff, by the end of the year, right? So, I'm not saying you should wait indefinitely, but it's probably a little bit too soon to pull the trigger on any kind of changing. All right, so how do they treat forgiven amounts, right? So I've alluded to this just in talking about how we differentiate between IDR and public service loan forgiveness. But if you're not on a public service loan forgiveness track, or you switch out of public service loan forgiveness, there still is an opportunity for forgiveness under the income-driven plans. They just have longer repayment timeframes. And those timeframes are different based on the plans that you're eligible for and the plans that you choose, right? It's either going to be 20 years or 25 years. And if you still have a balance remaining at the end of that time frame, that's what gets canceled, i.e. forgiven. And you may have to pay tax on that. Currently, there's a tax exemption on any student loan forgiveness that's received between 2021 and 2025. 2025, next year, is going to be a huge congressional year, right? Again, vote, right? Elections matter. Who is in power is going to determine whether or not things like this get extended or they go away, right? So this has opened the door for potentially seeing student loan forgiveness becoming tax exempt more consistently, right? But it requires to have people elected that believe that same thing, right? So we'll see. And there's also the tax rates, that the income tax rates are also set to expire. So the tax cuts that were passed under the Trump administration previously are set to expire in 2025, which means they will go up, income taxes will go up, or whoever's in Congress is going to say, we're going to extend those, or we're going to do something different. Right, so 2025 is going to be a huge year in terms of things that are going to impact those with student debt, right? So if you want to have a say in what that is, then make sure that you vote before next Tuesday. All right, so public service loan forgiveness, very different than income-driven repayment forgiveness. So we've covered this a little bit. I want to just make sure everybody's on the same page, but only direct loans are eligible, right? So if you've got other loan types, like health profession student loans, loans for disadvantaged students, those older school Pell program loans, Perkins loans, you want to consolidate those into a direct consolidation loan so they will be eligible for public service loan forgiveness or income-driven repayment. For public service loan forgiveness specifically, income-driven plans qualify, standard 10-year plan payments qualify as well, although not terribly helpful. Unless maybe you made a couple of standard 10-year plan payments as you initially entered repayment, those can still be counted. But you generally, don't see, we don't recommend people use a standard 10-year payment plan when they're trying to reach public service loan forgiveness. You do have to average at least 30 hours per week with that qualifying organization, so 501c3, state, federal, municipality, any other type of government, local government agency will qualify. And then once you've reached that 120 monthly payment threshold, you can apply to have your remaining balance forgiven. So consolidate if necessary, right? If you have those loan types that don't have direct in the name, then you're going to want to consolidate, at least consolidate those loans that don't have direct in the name. You probably don't want to do a full consolidation if you already have some public service loan forgiveness progress, because that may lower that progress. You want to use an income-driven repayment plan. Right now, there's some uncertainty around, those of you that are in SAVE are not currently earning public service loan forgiveness credit, right? But we've talked about, what you can do, or you can also wait to see what is available next. File taxes separately if you're married, again, if it makes sense to do so, but generally if you're the sole student debt holder and you're married, it's probably going to make sense for you to file your taxes separately, but it does depend on a bunch of other factors. Submit your employment certification forms at least annually, right? So you can have that count continually updated. For example, in this particular veterinarian's case, they think that they have 7 years of qualifying time. Maybe they do, and this just hasn't updated yet. That could be a very real possibility. That's one of those side effects we're kind of seeing right now, because all of the applications have been paused. It could be that they submitted an application earlier this year and that hasn't been reflected yet in their data and will be later, right? But if you see a number here that's lower than you're expecting, then you want to either submit a new employment certification form or check on the status of one that you've submitted recently. So you want to see that count continually updated so you know about where you are in this process. Right, and you never know where your career might take you. I've already uploaded that. That's the one that shows the public service loan forgiveness credit. But as I posted some stats on there, this is happening, right? We had some real stumbles out of the gate for public service loan forgiveness being granted. This is a veterinarian who had a rather dramatic amount canceled or zeroed out under the temporary expanded public service loan forgiveness, which again is kind of another indication that, we're trying to make this easier rather than harder. So people that may not have gotten public service loan forgiveness right the first time were offered a second crack at it under the temporary expanded public service loan forgiveness program, which is still available, right? So if you were making payments using a non-income driven plan, then temporary expanded public service loan forgiveness can help you get credit for those payments that otherwise would not have qualified. So there are a lot of different opportunities there to help increase the likelihood that you reach public service loan forgiveness. We finally hit 1 million borrowers that were granted public service loan forgiveness just this October, and nearly all of them received public service loan forgiveness over the last 4 years. All right, so again, kind of an indication of, we've got one party that is kind of trying to usher this through, and we've got another one who would like to see this go away, right? So that is pretty obvious in the grand scheme of, how these elections are going to matter. Okay, so what should you do now? Well, we've kind of covered that through some of the questions that you guys have been asking. Feel free to pop any more in there, and I'm going to just make sure that we're all on the same page again on the what should you do now. But this kind of comes back to, there's always that desire to pay your loans back as fast as possible. But again, the federal student loan system generally does not incentivize that. Love it or hate it, you can work against it or you can work with it, right? And generally speaking, for most veterinarians, particularly those of you that are working towards public service loan forgiveness, you want to understand how to get to public service loan forgiveness because it will save you tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars in terms of repayment costs, right? So it's well worth your time and money to figure out how best to approach this. I wish everybody could just easily pay back their student loans like a regular loan, and it wasn't a punitive amount of your salary, but that's just not the world that we live in, right? And that's where a lot of these benefits come in to play and make this a little bit more financially reasonable. So some general rules of thumb: if your student debt to income ratio is less than 1, right? So your student debt balance is lower than your annual income, then you're likely to pay your balance to 0 before you reach forgiveness. Now, there are some discrepancies there, right? It depends on when that happened, but usually if you're starting repayment with a student debt to income ratio that's less than 1, then you're not likely to reach forgiveness. Maybe not even public service loan forgiveness, right? Because your payment may be high enough to extinguish the balance under an income-driven plan before you actually reach public service loan forgiveness. You can still choose to use an income-driven repayment option if you want to, but a standard 10-year plan will probably have a similar payment, right? So in those cases, accelerated payoff strategies are actually reasonable. The problem is we don't see this very often in veterinary medicine, right? For those that do use student loans, their student debt to income ratio is generally not less than 1. Right now, there are exceptions to that, like there is for anything, right? But overwhelmingly, we see student debt to income ratios greater than 1 for most relatively recent veterinary graduates. If your student debt to income ratio is greater than 2, then it is quite likely you're going to reach forgiveness, whether it's income-driven repayment plan forgiveness or public service loan forgiveness. If your employment qualifies, you're likely to reach forgiveness. And so it's going to benefit you to look into these income-driven repayment options and know best how to navigate them to save the most money possible. So what is your student debt to income ratio now? What might it be next year or the year after? How much forgiveness time do you have? Right, so you want to check your income-driven repayment plan eligibility, right? So you know which IDR profile you fall into. You want to check your forgiveness payment count adjustment, so you know how far away you are until you reach forgiveness. But generally speaking, if it were my dog, if I was in save, I would stay put, at least for now. If I was in pay as you earn, I'm going to continue making those minimum payments. I'm going to check my anniversary date, stay put, at least for now. right? If I'm using an income-based repayment plan, same thing. I'm going to continue making those minimum payments, check my recertification date, stay put, likely for now. But I also want to know, if I'm in the old version of IBR, am I eligible for pay-as-you-earn? When they reopen that, do I maybe want to move to pay-as-you-earn? Right. So that might be something that I would check in on. It's amazing that just this. It's really hard for me to not emphasize this enough. A lot of veterinarians don't know which income-driven repayment options they're eligible for, let alone which one they're using. Right? There's an surprising amount of people who say I'm using IBR, but then when we look at their file, they're actually in pay-as-you-earn, or they say they're in pay-as-you-earn and they're actually in the old version of IBR, but they're eligible for pay-as-you-earn. Right? So this is where you have to know which options you have available to you and which one you're actually using, right? I know it's crazy confusing and nobody went to school to figure out the ins and outs of student loan repayment, but thankfully there's a few of us that do look at this quite regularly, and you have to know those details. If you don't, you could be hurting yourself and not even know it, right? So those are the first basic steps, is just identifying which repayment plan are you using, which ones are you eligible for, and is there a better one for you that you could be using right now? Especially when it comes to public service loan forgiveness, right? You don't want to be in the old version of IBR if you're eligible for a newer version that has a lower monthly payment. You're going to save all of that money in the differences in the monthly student loan payments if you ultimately receive that tax-free forgiveness at the end. Do not defer, right? And that can be difficult, especially for those of you that are mentors, or maybe you're kind of managing or responsible for interns and residents yourself, helping them understand that deferring is a no-no, right? And that's still one of those kind of reflex reactions in the medical training community, right? As I go do an internship, I go do a residency, I go do a postdoc or a PhD program, and I defer my loans, right? Do not defer your loans, right? Deferment is not forgiveness eligible. It racks up a bunch of interest, and whether you end up reaching forgiveness or not, you're going to end up paying more than you have to towards your student loans, right? So we need to help our colleagues stay out of deferment, right? Coach them to get into an income-driven plan and also look for that public service loan forgiveness credit. I believe every resident at an academic institution should be receiving public service loan forgiveness credit, but I don't get to sign off on all those forms. Right? It's actually that simple. You have to find somebody that's willing to sign off on the form that says you're an employee of that organization, right? For public service loan forgiveness purposes. I'm pretty sure when I read that form, and just knowing what my wife went through during her residency, those are all public service loan forgiveness eligible. So find somebody there, shop that form around until you find somebody that's willing to sign that. And hopefully maybe some of you all would be willing to sign that on behalf of some of your interns and residents. One of the other things that happens during residency at academic institutions is that often you have to take a master's alongside of that, right? And if you take enough classes, just like when you were in veterinary school, your loans will be automatically put into an in-school deferment, right? Now, you can waive that deferment, but it's better to do it ahead of time. Know it's coming. So you say to your loan servicer, look, I'm going to be enrolled in school again, but I want to make sure my loans stay in an income-driven plan because I want to continue earning forgiveness credit, right? You could do that, right? Otherwise, the loans will get put into deferment first, and then you have to get them out of deferment and reapply for an income-driven plan. So better if, again, this is part of that education that I'd love to see more academic institutions institute when new interns, new residents start at their programs, particularly those of you that have these masters assigned, associated with them, to help them avoid those in-school deferments automatically being applied. Well, let's see another question coming in from Emily. Would any of the payments deferred during a residency be eligible for buyback? Probably not. You can try. Yeah, I'm not. I don't believe that's going to be successful. But which is why, again, it's so important to try to proactively get ahead of those things, because it's very difficult to fix those things retroactively. Deferment is in-school deferment is very difficult to correct, right? There are few, if any, options for getting in-school deferment time to be eligible for any kind of repayment. Now, if you are lucky enough where those loans were actually put into a forbearance instead of deferment, then the forbearance time can be eligible, right? But so we'd have to dig into your file a little bit to see, what status were your loans actually in. A great place to start would be checking that payment count adjustment, right? So if you see a payment count adjustment and you received maybe repayment credit, income-driven repayment credit for that prior residency time, then you may get lucky and get some public service loan forgiveness credit by submitting a public service loan forgiveness employment certification form, right? So find somebody that friendly from that residency time to sign off on that form for you. It never hurts to submit it, right? But if your loans were truly in an in-school deferment because you were taking some classes during that time, then it's highly unlikely that you'll get public service loan forgiveness credit for that. I doubt that. That will be forever your worst financial mistake. I doubt that. We all make financial mistakes, right? But we learn from them. Try to prevent anybody that was within earshot of you from making that same mistake that you made. But learn from it and move on. It's not the end of the world, right? But ideally, again, if we could go back and do everything perfect, of course, right? But now we learn from them and try to pass on what we've learned to those behind us. Consolidation, you got to be a little bit careful, right? If you find that you've got health profession student loans, loans for disadvantaged students, Perkins loans, these older Pell program loans, if you especially if you're kind of a academic lifer, or there's nothing but public service loan forgiveness on the horizon for you, then consolidate those loans, right? But if you're not sure, post on the message boards, please, right? Because it's one thing if you've got $60,000 of health profession student loans and it's half of your student loan balance, and you don't see yourself doing anything other than working in academia, then we're going to try to help you get those health profession student loans into a consolidation loan and on track for public service loan forgiveness. But if you've got $2,500 of Perkins loans and $250,000 of direct loans, it's probably not going to make a lot of sense for you to worry about consolidating that. Of course, kind of going back to that, the perfect being enemy of the good, of course, it would have been ideal if you would have consolidated that back when you started repayment. But at this point, it's probably not worth pursuing if it's such a small share of your overall balance, right? But if you're not sure on that, post on the message boards and we'll help to kind of work through that with you. Here's just, again, that, if maybe not applicable for you all, but those of you that are going to be overseeing the next generation of specialists, right? If your program, puts them into a master's, or, they're starting that, during their grace period. So there's, for some of the specialties, they graduate right from veterinary school and they go right into residency, right? And if you go right into a residency that has a master's in clinical sciences with it, or some other master's associated with it, or maybe even an MPH or something else, if you get re-enrolled in school before your grace period ends, then your loans get stuck in that in-school status until you finish that program, right? And this is particularly harmful for those that do, kind of PhD residency programs, right? Those PhD programs can last a long time. And if your loans get stuck in an in-school status for the next 6, 7, 8, 9 years, that's going to rack up a lot of interest. And you're not going to be able to get any kind of forgiveness credit for those, right? So those are the ones that are really difficult, right? So the extent that any of you know that, or you're, mentors for any folks that are heading into those, that's where we could use your help, right? And we're happy to, meet with you and do kind of a intro with them if you're not sure, right? I'd love to be able to find these folks that do these extended programs that fall into this black hole in the student loan repayment system, who get unfairly punished just from going directly from vet school into those programs, just because of how the student loan system is set up. But you can't avoid it, right? But you have to act in a specified period of time. Yeah, and for those that, if you oversee interns, academic interns, most of them, we want them to, so if you think about the timing of that, they graduate generally in May, they start that internship mid-June, right? Their loans are still in their grace period, right? They're not going to get any public service loan forgiveness credit for their loans while they're in the grace period. But if they consolidate and choose to end their grace period early, they can get their loans into repayment right around the time they're starting their internship, which means they can get a full 12 months of public service loan forgiveness credit for that academic internship. But they have to consolidate and waive their grace period in order to do that, right? And we just don't see enough students that act on that. We try our damnedest to get them that information as they're going out the door, but it'd be really helpful if they heard it from you too, as they're coming into those internships. All right, so avoid these common mishaps. Consolidation, procrastination. If you need to consolidate, the sooner the better, as we just kind of touched on. Assuming an income-driven plan or public service loan forgiveness won't work. Hopefully you've seen enough data that shows you that it is working, right? It certainly helps to have an administration that's a little more friendly than non-friendly to help make that work. But people are receiving, lots and lots of people, lots and lots of veterinarians are receiving public service loan forgiveness as well as income-driven plan forgiveness under that one-time count adjustment. Choosing the right repayment option based on which ones you're eligible for, trying to keep your loans out of those deferment and forbearance status when appropriate, right? That SAVE forbearance is a little bit of a special use case right now. Putting your student loans ahead of more critical financial wellness, which is what we'll finish up touching on some of those topics. But paying more than your income requires, doesn't make a lot of sense. You're really not helping yourself. You'd be better off redirecting any of those extra payments towards those other critical financial wellness areas. And then switching away from an income-driven repayment plan or refinancing. Again, I know it's tempting now to assume that everything is just, going to fall apart for the student loan repayment system. Until it actually does, let's kind of pretend like it might survive, right? Because it may, right? It is definitely done pretty well up till now. We just have to wait and see what's going to happen out of this most recent uncertainty. All right, so build a budget, right? It's probably the single most important thing you can do financially is to know where your monthly ins and outs are going. It's interesting, as I poll veterinarians over the years here, roughly a 50-50 split kind of falls more on the side of no. And then my favorite ones are these others, right? These are all variations of no, by the way. Right, some real creative reasons or attempts at answering that question, right? But you can see that kind of pushes it on the side of no, right? More than half of people not having a budget, that's probably why your finances are not in the place that you'd like them to be, right? So some things that you should be thinking about or hopefully have before you start thinking about paying extra towards your student loans is having a good, robust emergency fund equal to 3 to 6 months of your expenses. Having retirement savings, and taking advantage of. I mean, most of you that are working for academic institutions probably have a 403B or I forget whatever it's called. It's the equivalent of a nonprofit organization 401k. But a lot of times you're going to have matching contributions. You should have or be contributing at least 10 to 15% of your gross income in there, but at least the amount that you need to contribute to receive the maximum matching contribution, right? You should always be taking advantage of that. It's free money. Don't leave it on the table. Paying off credit card, other less flexible debt first, even though the student loan balance is probably bigger, your student loans are more flexible, more favorable than any of these other types of debt, right? So you want to prioritize those less flexible debt, even if they have lower interest rates, right? So interest rates are not the end all be all of debt and shouldn't be the only deciding factor on which balance gets paid first. Saving for a down payment on a home or a practice. This was a really, so here, I'll share this one I just replied to today. And this was somebody who submitted their signalment form as part of this ACVIM session. But they're using SAVE. They've got 6+ years of public service loan forgiveness credit. It sounds to me like they were trying to reach public service loan forgiveness before they kind of embarked on buying a home, getting married, having kids. And that's cool. I mean, that's a perfectly reasonable goal. But now this uncertainty has kind of, interrupted that plan, right? But if you think about it, right, if you're looking to buy a house in the next 2 years, get married in the next 2 or 3 years and start having kids, if you're in save, you have no interest accruing, no payment due, that's an excellent opportunity to jumpstart building towards these goals, right? You've got at least another 6 months to work towards that down payment on your home, getting ready for getting married and starting a family, right? And if you're not going anywhere, right, if you're going to continue working in this public service loan forgiveness qualifying position, then is it really the end of the world if you hit forgiveness a year later than you were expecting to? Right. So, I know it can, be upsetting to put a detour in some of our plans, right? But look for the opportunities in them too, right? There's a unique opportunity to help you reach these goals maybe a little bit faster because you don't have a payment due. And unless you're one of those people that are like, hey, as soon as I reach public service loan forgiveness, I'm out of here, right? You can probably afford to take advantage of that and just redirect some of those funds to taking advantage of these particular goals. And that's what we covered in this message board discussion with this particular specialist. All right, enjoy life, right? Don't let your student loans stop you from doing anything that you were otherwise planning to do. The good news, loan repayment will end, right? You'll either earn enough to pay off the balance before you hit forgiveness, or you'll hit forgiveness, right? Either way is fine, right? Just pick the pathway that makes the most financial sense for you. Try to take as much of the emotion out of it as you possibly can. It's been extremely difficult lately. But hopefully going through sessions like this and giving you a sounding board and some ideas and knowing what's real versus what's not can help with alleviate some of that stress. If you have more questions, post on the student debt message board area. We've got a lot of experience with a lot of different circumstances. So take advantage of that resource if anything questionable comes up for you. Any other questions that you all have about your student loans, your experience with student loans, things that you're seeing? Maybe if you even had the opportunity to do your physical exam on your student loans while we've been sitting here, things that you learned or things that are jumping out at you that you want to ask about now, I would encourage you to do that. Anything else in the student debt center that you want to see? I have been not using the simulator lately on purpose, although that is the other tool that's available. If you want to project what this looks like long-term cost-wise for your different repayment options, you can do that using the student loan repayment simulator. The reason why I haven't been doing a lot of that is because I'm still waiting to see what is going to be next, right? There's just a little bit too much uncertainty for me to run a simulation for somebody who's got at least another 4 years of repayment when I'm not terribly confident of which repayment options are going to be available there. But if you want to plug some numbers in to get some ideas, for instance, if this person wanted to switch from IBR, let's say, and if we go back to their signalment form here, their most recent adjusted gross income shows 100,252. They're currently earning 130, right? So if I go and plug those in, right? So I'll put 130 in here. I'll change this one to reflect what their recent adjusted gross income would be, because that would be the number that you use if you were to switch away from another plan or to recertify your income. I'll leave the family information current here, but if you want to, you can put the not yet. They're going to get married in a couple of years, right? How will they file their taxes. I really don't have enough information on their spouse or future spouse to really enter this in, right? If we wanted to go deeper into that, we could, but that's why I'll leave that out of there for now. But if I run that from a public service loan forgiveness standpoint, right, this is where we'll see what that IBR 2009 payment would be. And so hopefully that'll run. There it goes. So here, this is what I was talking about earlier, right? Because I already had done this as part of the reply on the message boards there. So if right now they have a $0 payment due because they're in the save forbearance, but if they were to switch to IBR 2009, their payment would be nearly $1,000 a month. Now that might be fine, right? But they've got a lot of other stuff on their plate that they were working towards life-wise, right? Could that $971 per month be better put towards those other areas, at least in the short term, right? So those are the things that you might want to look at and consider. But you can also see here that if you did this for another 4 years, you'd make about $64,000 more of payments, $233,000 of that remaining balance would be forgiven. This is why public service loan forgiveness is such a good deal, right? So you're effectively getting a return of 17% per year compared to what your student loan balance is on that outcome. Anything else come up for you all while we're here? If not, I'll cut you loose and can move on with your day. All right, not seeing anything else come in. So thanks again for the opportunity to meet with you all, and thanks again for carving out some time out of your crazy busy schedules to talk about student loans. Hopefully we checked all the boxes in terms of what you were expecting to hear from this. I know it's being recorded, and we'll also provide links to the resources and the slides that we used here if you want to click back through them and review anything. And of course, you have access to us, Becca and myself, on the student debt message board area to help you work through any questions that come up for you going forward. So stay plugged in, remember, vote before next Tuesday if you haven't already voted, and then look for what comes next. And we'll put some information out there, try to keep you up to date, and give you our best interpretation on what we think is the best way to proceed based on what comes out of the SAVE litigation as well as what comes out of the election next week.
Thank you, Tony, for a great session and sharing your wealth of knowledge. We really appreciate it. And for those of you looking for CE information, that form to fill out to get your CE certificate will be included in the follow-up email that will come from studentdebt@vinfoundation.org. So keep an eye out for that as well.
Very cool. All right. Well, thank you, Becca, and thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your day.